from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I am pleased to welcome you to our program today. We are here to honor veterans of the different wars that Americans have fought over time. A few days ago, on November the 11th, we all paused to honor our veterans, and at that time at North Idaho College we did a special panel and program, and we invited 3 of those panelists to come on this program on that day, but we are now broadcasting it a couple of weeks later. I'm so pleased to welcome to the program, first of all, Bliss Bignell, who is an attorney in Idaho. He is a veteran of World War II, and he also was a civilian attorney with the Navy in the Korean War. He received the Infantry Combat Badge, and Bliss, welcome to the program. And I also want to say to our viewers, you are really responsible for us getting all this program together today, and we appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.
And I also want to say to our viewers that have not been with us as long as I've been around, that 26 years ago when we started this program, in early September 1972, Bliss Bignell was our very first guest, and after 26 years, Bliss, you've returned, and we're happy to have you back on the program.
Appreciate it.
Our second guest today is Jerry Burns. He was a member of the military in the Korean and Vietnam Wars and is a veteran. And Mr. Burns has been on our panel at the college today, and Mr. Burns has received the Air Force and Navy commendations, and we're very, very pleased, Jerry Burns, to have you on the program today. And our third guest today is Ted Okelvich, who is a veteran of World War II. He served many, many years in the military and has received at least 11 medals for all of his work and years. And he, too, has been with the college today on our panel. And we, Ted Okelvich, welcome you to the program. We're pleased to have you here. And on behalf of our panel and staff, I want to say to all 3 of you who represent many other veterans that we express our appreciation and what you've done for the country, and we thank you for being here to answer our questions today. And as always, I'm very pleased to have our regular 2 panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And on our system that we use and tradition, we will ask Janelle Burke to ask today's first question.
Bliss, my first question is for you, and I want to ask each one of the members of the Armed Services in order some questions so that our viewers can get to know you a little bit better, because I think you do represent veterans all over. What branch of the service were you in, Bliss? And then when did you go in, and what kind of job did you do while you were there?
Janelle, I was one of those 18-year-olds that volunteered in July 1944. I was sent to Camp Boulders, Texas, where Mr. Baker also trained, for your information, and took infantry training there. It was supposed to be an 18-week course, but because of the Battle of the Bulge starting out in December, they cut our time sharp, and we were sent overseas immediately. And I wound up in action in Belgium and the Rhineland. And I was a frontline rifleman, that's what I was.
And you came back then to this country and after the war, and you've had a success story there too.
That's true. I think it's a success. Yes, I came back. I came back to the University of Utah. I had 1 year before I went in. And I went to Georgetown Foreign Service School, graduated there about 25 years before Mr. Clinton did. And I wound up at George Washington Law School. And I was in the government for about 5 years before coming out here to practice law. I've been here since 1955.
Jerry, what branch of the service were you in, and how did you progress through your career?
I was in the United States Navy, went in 1946, tried all of the grades from seaman first through petty officer ranks. I was the chief petty officer, received a warrant appointment, then got a commission, ensign through lieutenant commander. I worked primarily on aircraft carriers. My final tour was over in Vietnam. I made 3 tours there as the Air Wing maintenance officer in charge of the maintenance of all the aircraft.
Wow, what carrier were you on?
Well, over there I was on first the Hancock and then the Bonhomme Richard for two trips.
And I understand that that's dangerous duty on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier.
It's no picnic. On the flight deck, there's constant hazards. Everywhere that you move, there's an aircraft turning up and blowing extremely hot gases. They're refueling, they're loading bombs at various times. They're moving aircraft, and at every step of the way, the individual is responsible for his own safety.
And Ted, can you tell us something about the branch of the service you were in and what you've done?
I was in the Navy. I started in 1937, and I worked my way up. I was a chief petty officer in the Navy. I worked for the Navy for actually 37 years. I left the Navy and become a civil servant, and I worked up. I was chief engineer for Standard Missile for the Navy.
Now, you did a rather interesting thing at one point in your career. Can you tell our audience about that?
I think a lot of things when I went to the Normandy the first time, I was a Griscom-Russell solo shell evaporator expert, and they sent me to Normandy to install the water purification systems. That's what they are. They're evaporators, and put them in the swimming pools on the Normandy. Also, they sent me to Staten Island to put them on another ship, the AKA-12, the USS Libra. One afternoon while I was over on the Libra, they caught the Lafayette, the Normandy, caught fire. It was the USS Lafayette, the Americans called it. It was the SS Normandy that capsized at the dock Pier 88 in New York in 1942, and they eventually cut it up for razor blades because they couldn't salvage it.
Steve Sheen.
Well, gentlemen, we're talking about Veterans Day today, and I thought maybe I would ask each of you to give me a little bit of your impression, personal impression of what Veterans Day means to you personally, and then maybe comment how do you think it's remembered in the minds of most American people today? Bliss, would you start?
Well, I probably grew up in a Veterans Day atmosphere. My father was a veteran of World War I. Both my mother and my father were in veterans organizations all my childhood days. Veterans Day was probably the greatest day we celebrated in our town. My dad ran a drugstore, and there was never a Veterans Day that we didn't fill our window with veterans pictures and so forth on the situations. So it means a lot to me, it still does. And I try to do something every Veterans Day. This is probably what I'm doing this year, but I even put in Veterans Day windows across the street on occasion. And it makes me remember and be very thankful that I'm here alive today.
Jerry?
My principal remembrance is individuals, and it's a wide range of them. Everyone from pilots down through the young fellow who works the flight deck. The thing that amazed me was their dedication to duty, their concern for their brothers. And I recall that very vividly, and I'll keep it in my mind forever.
Thank you. Ted?
Well, as a veteran and people in the American Legion, I belong to the American Legion, the Post 14 here in town, and I believe the Veterans Day honors those that passed on. It helps me remember my shipmates that I was with during the war that didn't come back. They met with unfortunate circumstances. I was very fortunate, and I say a lot of prayers for them because it's a hard life when you have to end it early, and I don't want to have to end it early.
Well, and again, there were two parts to my question, and the second part was how do you believe Veterans Day is remembered by most of us? And I'll move back to Bliss and work down the row again, but it's ironic in a way. I think anybody, as are you three, who's a veteran of a war, that person's fondest hope would be that Americans now and in the future won't have to do what you did. But are many of us who have not had the experiences you've had, are we forgetting, do you think, that the real meaning of Veterans Day, Bliss?
Well, it's kind of hard, but with all the TV on, I can't understand how you could forget anything. I feel like I relive World War II almost every Saturday night in some form or another. But as for the individuals goes, I do think it's very difficult for people who haven't gone through this experience to appreciate Veterans Day and what it's all about. And I think that's probably the reason why it appears to us that you don't have that much interest in the youth today.
Jerry?
I feel that the Veterans Day is remembered mainly by veterans, mainly because it occupied a large portion, an important portion of our lives. Too many people miss the opportunity to serve, not through their own fault many times, but they missed it. And in so doing, they'll never have the appreciation for the veterans and the services that they perform for this country.
And Ted?
I think that the one thing that Jerry touched on, that there, a lot of the people do not realize what the veterans went through. You know, when you're calling up the beach of Tarawa or Iwo Jima under that heavy, intense fire, people don't realize what that really was. When those people had to get out of those landing ships and start up that beach, it was hell, literally hell, because there were sheets of bullets coming down that beach, and they had no air coverage. The air coverage was nil at Tarawa. And those are the things that people don't understand, and the average civilian hasn't, they have no concept of what that really was, and they don't think about it. Well, when they see veterans, they say, they served their country, so what?
Thank you.
I want to have you give our viewers some personal experiences, and Ted was just referring to that in some extent. Jerry, I'm going to start with you and then ask all three of you to take a situation and relive it to the extent of sharing with our viewers the magnitude of what happens to individuals during war. Maybe that will also give viewers an appreciation of how freedom has been defended. I know you had a very close call, and if you wouldn't mind sharing that personal experience.
Well, I've had close calls, and many of them were my own making. But the life on the flight deck is extremely hazardous. And my fondest remembrances are the individuals who've lost their lives there. And I call it fond remembrances because I want to keep it in my mind. It's a constant reminder that anywhere is hazardous. The flight deck of a carrier was doubly hazardous. The pilots who flew off and landed aboard the carrier and performed their missions are real heroes to me. The pilots went through a tremendous experience on takeoff, then a controlled crash on landing, and they walked away. I made 460 some carrier landings myself in the back seat. I was always air crew, and I think it was scary for the pilot, but for the fellow sitting in the back seat, he doesn't know what's going on, and he's petrified. But the ordinary serviceman grows accustomed to these, and it becomes part of his life, because that's the way that he has committed himself by staying in the service. And I don't regret one bit of it. I may not want to live it again.
Would you share the one experience you shared with me earlier today about how you were saved on the ship when an accident took place?
I made the mistake of stepping behind a jet, an old F-9F, and I was blown down the deck. And in the process, running parallel to me were a couple of yellow shirts and blue shirts. They're the young fellows who handle the aircraft on the carrier deck. And their main intent was to save me before I reached the propellers of a group of ADs that were turning up. And at great risk to themselves, they dove on top of me and saved me from going in. And for this, I'll always remember the yellow shirts and the blue shirts.
Thank you very much. Ted, would you share with us a time?
I think one of the worst moments I experienced was I was on the DD-734, and we were on a radar picket ship. It was a radar picket ship. It was 140 miles south of Kyushu. We got hit. We got hit by what they call a Baka bomb. It was actually a kamikaze that had a bomb in the nose of it. It went in through our scullery, went in the IC room, and blew up over the top of the gyro. And it blew the other side of the ship out. The next day, I had to go in the fire room and bring the bodies out. That is a gruesome thing to have to do, because they were in various mutilated conditions. And in fact, that second day, I couldn't find one body, and I knew he was down there somewhere. And then the third day, I went down and I found him behind the boiler. He went back there to take steam readings and take the temperature of the oil and go into the boilers. the thing that really bothered me was when he had fallen forward, he grabbed the handrail and froze onto the catwalk. I had to break his shoulders to get him out of there and put him in a rubber bag. That is a terrible thing to have to do. It stayed with me for years. I had a lot of nightmares.
It gives you a different perspective of life, doesn't it, when you come back to civilian life?
Yeah, it's a terrible thing, though, just the same. You remember those things forever. Those are things the public can't experience, really.
Bliss?
How much time do I have? You know, we were coming out of the Ardennes after 3 weeks in cold weather without any deal. Most of us were frozen half to death. We've been fighting half the time. The other time we were carrying bodies back on stretchers and bringing up water cans and ammo. So we were on duty almost 24 hours a day during that time. We were asked to take a little town in Rhineland. And the town below was probably a very small town. It had a big wall around it, and the entranceways were stacked with debris and so forth. So you had to go up and over the wall in order to get into the town to take it. And my company went in. We were rather safe then, but that's when we found out that the town immediately above it, they wouldn't take out with tank or with airplanes. And it was lined up with snipers on the top of that wall. And during that one day, I imagine my company lost 50% of its men. Something rather interesting, funny in a way, happened, because as I came into this one house, I heard someone yell, "Hey, there's a cow here." And over on the other side in the kitchen, one said, "There's rice in the pantry." And I said, "Well, let's have some rice pudding." And we were under fire all this time, remember. And I walked into the part of the barn there that was part of the house. And here was a medic taking shrapnel out of the hind end of the dirtiest white cow I'd ever seen. And another GI was milking it. And we had our rice pudding. And that was the beginning, because the next morning we were going to have hot food for the first time in 3 weeks. And the cooks had brought all their food in big cans outside the wall. They said, "Come and get it." Only 5, with no brains, including myself, went over the top of that wall for breakfast that morning. And we ate. And just about that time, the mortar shells started to fall. It was misdirected because there was a house outside the wall we used as a hospital, and it was filled with wounded soldiers, many of our own friends. Instead of hitting us, those mortars went through 3 floors to the bottom, and to this day I still hear men screaming out loud from that. And sometimes I wonder whether I really should have gone for that breakfast.
Thank you for sharing that, Bliss. We appreciate it. Janelle Berg.
I think that all 3 of you were in Korean War action or in some way working during the Korean War. But 2 of you have World War II experience, and certainly Jerry would have remembered what it was like from the stories. Can you compare the 3 wars, and then Jerry, the Vietnam War? Let's start again with Bliss, comparing somewhat how the evolution has occurred as far as wartime activities are concerned.
Well, I felt that the Korean War, especially when the Marines and the Army went up to Chosin Reservoir, and the Chinese came in by the hundreds of thousands, and the cold was very similar to Europe in 44. The 44 and 45 winter, where I fought in the Battle of the Bulge in Rhineland, was the coldest recorded weather that had ever occurred in Europe before and since. The weather in Korea at that time was probably even colder than that. So the men went through the same situation from that, whereas it was a jungle warfare in Vietnam, which I didn't get to observe much. But
you certainly talked with a lot of young men who came back.
I really do, but I think there was more, it was more guerrilla warfare because of the climate in Vietnam, and more people, I think, in the back got the actual fight, whereas in World War II, unless you're up in the frontline infantry in combat, very few people actually had a risk of their life being taken.
What would you say, Jerry, were some of the observations you'd make about the changes in the war atmosphere?
It's a wrong term to use, but World War II was a popular war in that it had the full support of the people. Mm-hmm. The Korean War came along, and very few people knew why we were over there, and no one realized what we were running up against, like the Red Chinese entering the war. It was cold, and I was up there in the cold weather, but I've been in cold weather before. But when we come to the Vietnam War, that's an unpopular war. And at that time, there were all sorts of protests going on in the country, and it adversely affected people in the Navy. But the thing I've got to say about the spirit of the Navy is, in spite of the protests, they continued. Many of us disagree with the fact that we were over there. But we go back to the mine is not to question why, mine is but to do or die, and that philosophy took over. The fact that, and I remember many of the bombing raids, and in Vietnam I was privy to all of the briefings beforehand, and the bombers would go out, and their targets would be Wiblicks, which are waterborne logistic craft, and oxen. The reason is that they were the vehicles by which arms were being brought into South Vietnam from Laos. And we abhorred the fact that they had to be killed. And it was a duty, because if they were not killed, then the arms would get over and they would be used against our own troops. It was a war of a lot of contrasts, and as I say, we shouldn't have been over there in the first place, but that's a political decision, and the Navy is not a political organization in terms of the people who are running it or working it.
Ted, what do you think are some of the differences? You've spanned a long life.
From World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnamese War, you got three different types of war entirely. Like Jerry said, one was popular and the other two were not popular. One was very unpopular, but the type of war was different. The war in Europe was much like it was in North Korea. It was on land. The war in the Pacific was all amphibious. They had to go island for island hopping. When they got into Vietnam, it was a rice paddy to rice paddy. It was little villages here and there, and you never knew when you were going to run into the Viet Cong. There was no question about that. The North Korean War was when the Chinese come over the Yalu River and headed south. There were hundreds of thousands of them compared to the few thousand men we had. Our people were just driven south because they were outnumbered terribly. It was a terrible cold winter, and people were freezing to death. And it was just one heck of a war. Vietnamese, it's warm down there, but there's all kinds of other problems. The water, the temperature, and you never knew who was friend or foe.
Your conversation about the popularity, difference in popularity between the wars, and particularly the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, leads me to a question I had intended to ask anyway, and that is the fact that the fortunes, if you want to call it that, of military service have risen and fallen over the past few years. I think they probably reached a low ebb after the Vietnam War and peaked again with the Gulf War. How do you view military service today, and is it something that you would recommend to young people searching for a career? Bliss?
My only son is in the service right now. He's 17 years in the Air Force in Texas. He's been over to Korea for a year. And frankly, I think it's one of the greatest things that ever happened to him.
Jerry?
I'm firmly in favor of young fellows going into the military. I think the military gives an excellent opportunity to adjust to life and to prepare for life. The big problem that we have, of course, is that too many people send in their problem children and expect them to be cured in the military. I ran into a lot of that, and I know that it's continuing through today. But they are weeding them out more and more. It's becoming more and more difficult. They're becoming more selective in the services, and I heartily approve of that rather than the blanket anybody who can sign or anybody that can walk in is taken.
And Ted, your views on military service today?
I think they're excellent for a young person today. Most of your missile systems have gone digital. They're all digital computers. They went from analog to digital in the last 5 years. There's much opportunity for them to learn a trade, to learn things that they won't experience in the civilian life, and they won't learn them in school. It's where they'll learn to get along with each other. They'll learn to love their comrades that they're going to work and fight against, the side by side. It's something that they'll experience there that they won't experience anywhere else.
Well, in that you talk about experiences in military life that you can't get as a civilian. We don't have a lot of time left, but I thought I'd start another round of questions based on that. All of you have seen things that no one should see, and you've also had some very, very good experiences in the military. Overall, was your military experience something that was positive in terms of the rest of your life? Bliss?
One of the greatest things that ever happened to me.
The military is the one cause of any successes that I realized in this life. They trained me, they taught me electronics, they taught me management, aircraft management, and they taught me to live with people. And I would advocate that as a good basis for anyone.
Thank you, Jerry. Ted?
I think it's taught me a lot. I was a top manager in the civilian life after I left the military itself. I run a large department of 225 people at a place codenamed Nemesis. It's a naval weapons station in Port Hueneme, California. It takes care of all the missile ships in the fleet. They take care of everything from the digital computers to the missiles themselves, the radars, everything. And it's an excellent place to learn.
Thank you.
We have just about 1 minute left, and I'll just end with Bliss because I'll start where I did 26 years ago and say again to him, thanks for helping to start this process a long time ago. But in just like 20 or 30 seconds, what would you recommend how we stay prepared for the future to defend the country?
I think we're going to have small wars from now on, if not large wars. And I think we've learned through history that you've still got to be prepared because you don't know when those events are going to take place. And I'm probably for a very strong military because of that.
On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of our panel and our staff, to all three of you gentlemen, thank you so much. I've been very touched by your comments today, and we again thank you for what you've done for our country. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join us again next week at this same time when we will discuss yet another important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.